Before we really get started here, I would like to just let you know that this story does involve a brief discussion of the untimely passing of infants and another discussion of extreme neglect in childhood. Just want to let you know that that is part of the story today. You are also going to see me actually use my classical studies minor. So here we go. Hic jacet Kaspar Hauser, enigma sui temporis, ignota nativitas, occulta mors. Here lies Kaspar Hauser, riddle of his time. His birth was unknown, his death mysterious. Occulta mors would be a cool name for a metal band, but you can find this provocative inscription on a tombstone in Ansbach, Germany. So, who was Kaspar Hauser? What made him the riddle of his time? Can DNA analysis help us answer an even more dramatic question? Was Kaspar Hauser a lost prince? We don't know exactly when or where Kaspar Hauser was born. He appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, in Nuremberg, Germany on May 26, 1828. He looked to be about 16 years old, but he could barely walk or speak, and his clothes didn't fit very well. When the police tried to speak to him, he wasn't able to answer their questions. He carried with him a letter by an anonymous writer explaining that this boy had been placed in the writer's care in 1812, and that the boy had been raised in total isolation. Kaspar would later explain that he'd been living in a dungeon. That kind of extreme neglect could explain his behavior, particularly the way that he struggled to communicate. Supposedly, an unknown man had taught the boy how to write his name, Kaspar Hauser, and say a few words, but then just left him in Nuremberg. In July, a jurist named Paul Johann Anselm Ritter von Feuerbach visited Kaspar Hauser. The book von Feuerbach wrote, Kaspar Hauser, A Case of a Crime Against the Soul of a Human Being, helped to make Kaspar famous. Von Feuerbach is also responsible for one of the big ideas about Kaspar's identity and background, but he also helped to make arrangements for Kaspar to have a home as rumors and speculation began to spread. Von Feuerbach and the mayor of Nuremberg selected a local scholar, Georg Friedrich Daumer, to become Kaspar's guardian and tutor. Kaspar lived with Daumer for a year and a half, during which Daumer kept a diary about Kaspar's progress. Daumer taught Kaspar how to speak, read, write, draw, and play piano. Kaspar's vocabulary grew very fast, and he actually wrote an autobiography around the years 1828 and 1829. You can find passages from this autobiography, as well as a translation of von Feuerbach's book about Kaspar, in one of the sources I'll have listed in this video's description. Kaspar's time living with Daumer wasn't lacking in drama. Kaspar was injured in what he claimed to be an attempt on his life, resulting in a knife wound on his forehead. However, people immediately suspected that this wound was self-inflicted, and no one was ever caught or charged with the attack. Whatever really happened, this incident played into the speculation about Kaspar's identity. Did someone want him dead? After this incident, King Ludwig I of Bavaria got involved. With people speculating that Kaspar could have some kind of political importance, the king ordered that Kaspar be protected by police. Kaspar moved around and lived with other caretakers after having a falling out with Georg Daumer, but these other caretakers weren't exactly Kaspar's biggest fans, and there were more incidents. I'm not going to go through every move and detail here, but if you're interested in a more precise timeline of Kaspar's life, Decoding the Unknown has an excellent video about Kaspar Hauser. If you have a spare 3 hours in which to watch it, it's less of a video and more of a journey. In summary, various caretakers accused Kaspar of lying about things, including an incident involving a gunshot wound, and his familiarity with the Hungarian language. Basically, Kaspar heard some Hungarian words and claimed to recognize the language. When challenged along the lines of, "Oh, you know Hungarian? Prove it." Kaspar was like, "Oops, never mind, I was mistaken, I don't actually know how to speak this language." At one point, Kaspar became besties with Philip Stanhope, the 4th Earl Stanhope, who gained custody of Kaspar in 1831. Lord Stanhope believed Kaspar came from Hungary, and actually took him to Hungary on a couple trips to see if Kaspar remembered anything. Kaspar even claimed that his mother was a Hungarian countess, but he didn't recognize anything on their trips. Members of the Hungarian nobility were not impressed. There were some potential plans to take Kaspar to England to live with Lord Stanhope, but that didn't really work out, and Kaspar moved to Ansbach to live with a new tutor, Johann Georg Meyer, in late 1831. Kaspar found employment at a local law office, but he and Meyer didn't get along very well. On December 14th, 1833, a few days after having a really big argument with Meyer, Kaspar came home with a stab wound in his chest. He explained that someone had told him to go to a local garden, and there he'd be given some information about his past. But instead, a stranger stabbed him. On December 17th, 3 days after the attack, Kaspar Hauser died from his wounds. He was buried in the city cemetery of Ansbach. Kaspar Hauser's sudden, violent death, coming at the end of such a brief, mysterious life, sparked even more speculation about his identity and the manner in which he died. Just like that head wound he had received when he lived with Georg Dahmer, people immediately started questioning whether or not the stab wound that had killed him was self-inflicted or accidental. No one ever came forward with more information about what happened, and no one was ever charged with the murder of Kaspar Hauser. We are left with so many questions, with arguably the biggest being, who was Kaspar Hauser? We've already touched on the idea of him possibly having come from a noble Hungarian family, but the main idea regarding his origins was the one suggested by von Feuerbach in that book that he wrote about Kaspar Hauser. This was the idea that Kaspar Hauser was a lost prince, possibly even the rightful heir to the throne of the House of Baden. What was the House of Baden? Who were these people? At this time, Germany was split into various kingdoms and grand duchies. Among these was the Grand Duchy of Baden. It was ruled by a family called the House of Zahringen, which eventually became known more commonly as the House of Baden. The Lost Prince idea suggests that Kaspar was the son of Grand Duke Karl von Baden and his wife, Stephanie de Beauharnais, an adoptive daughter of Napoleon Bonaparte. Karl and Stephanie had 5 children: Princess Louise Amélie, an unnamed son born in 1812 and who unfortunately died soon after birth, Princess Josephine, a son named Alexander who also died soon after birth, and Princess Marie Amélie. In the Lost Prince idea, Kaspar would have been this unnamed son. If Kaspar was 16 years old when he appeared in Nuremberg in 1828, he would have been born in about 1812, like the baby prince. Okay, so let's put together what the House of Baden looks like here. We have Grand Duke Karl, married to Grand Duchess Stephanie de Beauharnais. I totally remember how to spell these things. Okay, now we're going to add their 5 children. Louise, Amélie, their unnamed son, born in 1812, Josephine, Alexander, who, like I mentioned before, like the unnamed son born previously, Alexander also did not live very long after birth, and the youngest, Marie Amélie. Okay, so just a quick reminder, in the Lost Prince idea for Kaspar Hauser, Kaspar would have been this unnamed son. Because if Kaspar Hauser had been about 16 in 1828 when he arrived in Nuremberg, he would have been born in approximately, the same year. Yep. So that's what we have so far. This idea hinges on the possibility that instead of dying soon after birth, the unnamed prince was switched with a sickly child, who then died, while the real prince was stolen away and locked in a dungeon. This whole baby switching scheme wasn't really new for royal families. Why? It's usually because of succession and who gets to be the next monarch, as well as ideas about legitimacy. We saw this in Britain when the son of King James II was born, and rumors spread that babies were switched, the baby presented as the new Prince of Wales wasn't actually the king's son, and therefore he couldn't be allowed to be the next king. It's not likely that that baby switching actually happened, and there's way more to the story than that, but that's not the story we're here for today. We've also seen rumors of a royal child being replaced by a substitute child in order to break that royal child out of prison. I'm not going to give a detailed example here because I've already covered it in my video about Prince Louis Charles of France. So why concoct a scheme like this within the House of Baden? Even though the daughters of Karl and Stephanie lived to adulthood and later had children of their own, they weren't allowed to inherit the throne. Karl had actually inherited the throne from his grandfather, Karl Friedrich. So because Karl didn't have any legitimate sons or brothers, we have to go back to grandfather Karl Friedrich to figure out who was next in line for the throne. Grand Duke Karl Friedrich of Baden married twice. First to Carolina Louisa of Hesse-Darmstadt. After she died, he married a baroness named Louisa Carolina, which isn't confusing at all. I'm going to refer to her as Countess Louisa of Hochberg, which was a title given to her later. Okay, let's go back up through the House of Baden to figure out what the line of succession is looking like. So we'll add Karl, Ludwig. So this is Grand Duke Karl's father. Now, he died before he became Grand Duke. That is why the succession went straight from Karl Ludwig's father, Karl's grandfather, who we'll add to Karl. Okay, here is grandfather, Grand Duke Karl Friedrich, and his first wife, Carolina Louisa. Okay, so this is how the succession has kind of gone down to Karl. Now let's add wife number 2, Louisa Carolina. Yep, and again, this is the woman that we refer to as Countess Hochberg. Okay, so that's what we're looking like so far. Karl Friedrich had children with both of his wives, but because his second wife, Countess Louisa of Hochberg, was a lower rank when they got married, her children weren't really allowed to be included in the line of succession and have a chance to inherit the throne. So, if Countess Louisa wanted her children to inherit the Grand Duchy, the descendants of Karl Friedrich's first wife would have to be removed from the line of succession. Countess Louisa of Hochberg is the alleged culprit, the mastermind behind the baby-switching shenanigans, in the idea that Kaspar Hauser is a lost prince of Baden. In this version of events, Countess Louisa would have stolen Karl and Stephanie's newborn baby son in 1812, apparently dressing up as a ghost in order to pull this off, replaced him with a sickly baby who didn't survive, and locked away the real prince in a dungeon. At the same time, a bunch of other members of the royal family died before they could inherit the throne, but there's no real evidence that they were murdered in order to remove them from the line of succession. It's also not clear why the real prince wouldn't have been removed more permanently after being imprisoned. Ultimately, Grand Duke Karl died quite young in 1818, at the age of 32. Before he died, he made arrangements for Countess Louisa's sons to be able to inherit the throne. Karl was succeeded by his uncle Ludwig, who in turn was succeeded by his half-brother, Countess Louisa's son Leopold. I'm going to go ahead and add the next 2 rulers of the Grand Duchy of Baden for the sake of completion and because I mentioned them. So, Karl was succeeded by his uncle Ludwig, but then Ludwig also didn't have any legitimate sons to whom he could pass the throne. And because of the arrangements Karl had made before he died, we get Leopold as the next Grand Duke after Ludwig. Of course, Leopold being the son of Louisa Carolina, Countess of Hochberg. Yep. So there we have it. There's our House of Baden. During the reigns of Ludwig and Leopold, Kaspar Hauser appeared in Nuremberg, and the rumors about his identity started spreading. So how could we test whether or not Kaspar Hauser was a Prince of Baden? We can compare DNA sequences, but in order to do that, we need sources of DNA from Kaspar and from Karl von Baden, Stephanie de Beauharnais, or people related to them. Where do we get these sources? Where might we find biological material from these people? We know Kaspar Hauser was buried in the Stadtfriedhof, the city cemetery of Ansbach. His tombstone is still there, but his remains have not been exhumed. I don't know the laws regarding exhumations in Germany, but this isn't really a forensics case. There's no medical legal aspect to it. And it's also not a situation that would necessarily involve repatriating remains or moving them to another cemetery. If you do know how this works in Germany, please let me know in the comments. So, if we can't access Kaspar Hauser's remains, where else can we look for DNA samples? After Kaspar died, the local prosecutor took possession of the clothes that Kaspar had been wearing when he was stabbed. The clothes were held by the court until 1888. Eventually they came into the possession of the Historical Society of Ansbach, and they're now held by the Margrave Museum in Ansbach. The whole outfit is on display in an exhibit dedicated to Kaspar Hauser. It's pretty stylish. Some of these clothes, the undergarments in particular, had bloodstains on them. In the late 1990s, scientists took samples from the bloodstained fabric for DNA testing. As a control, they tested parts of fabric that didn't have bloodstains for the presence of DNA as well. The samples from the non-stained fabric didn't provide any DNA, which is good. You don't want DNA in your negative control samples. The samples from the bloodstained fabric were sent to two separate labs for independent analysis: the Institute of Legal Medicine at the University of Munich and the Forensic Science Service Laboratory in Birmingham. The two labs extracted and sequenced mitochondrial DNA from the samples, and when they compared the samples they obtained, the sequences were identical to each other. So far, so good. That means the extraction and sequencing worked, and the DNA in those bloodstains is coming from the same individual. Since the lab sequenced mitochondrial DNA, the scientists needed DNA samples from someone maternally related to Stephanie de Beauharnais and her children. If you've seen my video about Prince Louis Charles of France, this next bit will probably be rather repetitive. The cells of your body, with the exception of egg and sperm cells, carry all of your DNA in two organelles, the nucleus and the mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell, because that's where energy is made. The DNA in your mitochondria is inherited from your biological mother, which is why it has become so useful for tracing maternal lineages. To find the mitochondrial DNA sequence of that unnamed prince, we need the sequence of Stephanie de Beauharnais. Luckily, she had 3 daughters. 2 living maternal relatives of Stephanie de Beauharnais donated blood samples for this first DNA study, their mitochondrial DNA having been passed from mother to daughter and down to them. Grand Duchess Stephanie is their great-great-great-grandmother. Once again, DNA samples were sequenced and analyzed independently at the 2 labs. Both relatives had identical mitochondrial DNA sequences, which means the sequences hadn't acquired any new mutations between those living descendants and their most recent common ancestor, Stephanie de Beauharnais. It also means that Stephanie's children would have the same sequence. The scientists also compared the sequences from the living relatives to the sequences from 500 unrelated people in a database, but none of them are matches for Stephanie's living relatives. When the scientists compared the mitochondrial DNA sequences from living relatives to the sequences obtained from Kaspar Hauser's clothes, the sequences differed in 7 places. There were too many differences for it to be explained by gene mutations within a single generation, from Stephanie de Beauharnais to her son. So the scientists concluded that Kaspar Hauser couldn't have been her son, and thus not a Prince of Baden. This study didn't put an end to the speculation about Kaspar Hauser being the Prince of Baden, and the technology and methods used for studying DNA improved, so more studies followed that initial DNA study that was published in 1998. In the early 2000s, the Munster Institute of Legal Medicine carried out a mitochondrial DNA analysis on some hair samples and other items attributed to Kaspar Hauser. The hairs came from the clothes held by the Margrave Museum in Ansbach. These tests produced different mitochondrial DNA sequences than those obtained from the bloodstains in the 1998 study, casting doubt on those previous results. The authors of this study used their results to say, well, this means we can't say Kaspar Hauser wasn't the Prince of Baden, basically disagreeing with the conclusions of that 1998 study. However, their own results weren't really consistent among their own samples, which is messy, and they didn't actually publish their study. This is super weird, and it's why I haven't provided a proper citation for it. I don't really know quite why they wouldn't publish their work. Maybe it's because the data sounds messy. One of the reasons we do publish articles about our research and experiments is so we can discuss it within the wider scientific community. Even if our experiments aren't successful, we can still learn from that. And reading other studies is how we learn what methods we can use to collect and analyze more data, what methods worked and how. That's how I found out what sequencing techniques and software I can use to explore the questions I'm asking in my PhD dissertation. Without access to an original article about a study, it becomes more difficult to know what their results really looked like and why they're making the arguments they're making, how they reach their conclusions. That weird study from the early 2000s was discussed in the most recent Kaspar Hauser DNA study. In some ways, this newest study is something of a response to the previous studies. It takes what we've learned about DNA over the past 20 years and advances in sequencing technology to try to make sense of all of this. The 2001-2002 study used Sanger sequencing, which was developed in 1975 and was also used for the Human Genome Project. The authors of the 2024 study, with the powers behind CITE and different sequencing techniques, figured that Sanger sequencing probably couldn't have picked up the small fragments of DNA from the hair shafts tested in the 2000s. After a person dies, their DNA starts to fall apart over time into fragments that are small and thus hard to study. Instead of DNA from the person who grew that hair from their own head, they might have been picking up DNA from some other origin, some contamination, which would explain any inconsistency among those samples and why the results didn't match the results from the 1998 study. The 2024 study used what they referred to as massively parallel sequencing, or MPS, which is also commonly referred to as next-generation sequencing, NGS, because it's the next generation after Sanger sequencing. I learned it as NGS and cannot tell you why we have two names for the same thing. NGS made it possible to sequence whole genomes. They also used primer extension capture, PEC, which was developed to sequence mitogenomes, mitochondrial genomes, of Neanderthals. It allows for the sequencing of those short fragments of mitochondrial DNA. All of these sequencing techniques and the history of how we've become able to study ancient DNA deserve their own video, but now that we've established methods, let's talk about materials. Parson et al. Used 3 independent samples attributed to Kaspar Hauser. The first came from those bloodstained clothes again. Over the years, there had been some doubt cast about the authenticity of those bloodstains. Rumors had spread about the possibility of the clothes and the stains being manipulated somehow to serve the purposes of the museum in Ansbach, basically to create shock value for their exhibit. If this had happened, it would impact any DNA results based on samples from the clothes, but like the baby switching stories, there isn't really any solid evidence that this took place. In addition to the bloodstained clothes, the scientists tested a total of 12 new hair shaft samples attributed to Kaspar Hauser. These hair samples are split into 2 groups: hair taken post-mortem, after Kaspar's death, and tested in Innsbruck in 2019, and hairs taken before Kaspar's death, ante-mortem, that were tested in Potsdam in 2021 and 2022. All of the mitochondrial DNA sequences from the hair shafts and the bloodstains were identical to each other, and to the sequences found in the bloodstains in the 1998 study. They all belonged to the same individual, and that individual was most likely Kaspar Hauser. That's great, but what about a relationship between Kaspar Hauser and Stephanie de Beauharnais? A reference sample from a maternal relative of Stephanie de Beauharnais gave the same mitochondrial haplogroup as what was found in her other living maternal relatives in the 1998 study. Good, we have solid samples for comparison. This time, they compared the mitochondrial haplogroups to which Kaspar Hauser and Stephanie de Beauharnais belonged. A mitochondrial haplogroup is a collection of mitochondrial genomes that descended from a common female ancestor. That's how we trace maternal lineages. Stephanie de Beauharnais and her female line descendants belong to the mitochondrial haplogroup H, specifically to the lineage H1BS. Kaspar Hauser belongs to haplogroup W. So, the evidence we have supports the same conclusion reached in 1998. Kaspar Hauser was not the son of Stephanie de Beauharnais, so he couldn't have been the lost prince of Baden. If Kaspar Hauser wasn't the prince of Baden, who was he? Where did he come from? Was he some kind of con man or a fraud? DNA can't really answer those questions. Kaspar Hauser shares a mitochondrial lineage with many people across Europe, so it's not really possible to use his mitochondrial DNA to narrow down his geographic origin. DNA can't tell us if he lied about living most of his life in a dungeon or in such severe isolation. It just says he doesn't have a close genetic relationship with Stephanie de Beauharnais, her children, and their descendants. So, the real origin of Kaspar Hauser, the child of Europe, remains a mystery. Whether he was the lost son of some noble or royal family or not, Kaspar Hauser has had a lasting impact that we still see in literature, film, and science. By the 1840s, not long after he died, several novels were written about him. In the 1970s, Werner Herzog made a film about him, The Enigma of Kaspar Hauser, and that's not even the only film made about him. Another film, simply titled Kaspar Hauser, came out in 1993. I forgot that Werner Herzog was in The Mandalorian. He's the guy who hires Din Djarin to go find Grogu. There are also a bunch of conditions named after him across multiple scientific disciplines, although these are not positive things. In medicine and psychology, Kaspar Hauser syndrome is the result of extreme deprivation and neglect in childhood. The Kaspar Hauser experiment in behavioral biology would explore the results of an animal growing up isolated from other members of his species. If you've ever heard a story about a feral child, then that's what this is. You might also see these referred to as the Kaspar Hauser complex or Kaspar Hauser effect. So the question remains, who are you, Kaspar Hauser? Instead of a book recommendation, if you'd like to learn more, this time I'm going to recommend 2 videos you can find right here on YouTube. I've already mentioned the first, which is the 3-hour-long Kaspar Hauser, The Prince Without a Past by Decoding the Unknown. The other is The Curious Case of Kaspar Hauser by Professor Terry King, who is one of the geneticists who worked on that 2024 study. I'd also like to mention that the Margrave Museum in Ansbach has a virtual walkthrough on their website where you can actually see their Kaspar Hauser exhibit. It's pretty neat. I really, really enjoyed it. Let me know if you check that out, and thank you for watching. So, I had not actually heard of the story of Kaspar Hauser until fairly recently, within, the past several months before I recorded this video. And that's kind of crazy to me. However, I had heard of the family of de Beauharnais before. And like I mentioned before, Stephanie de Beauharnais was an adoptive daughter of Napoleon Bonaparte. So how did that happen? Her father was this guy called Claude de Beauharnais. And he was a count over in France. And his cousin was Viscount Alexander de Beauharnais. Now, Alexander was executed during the French Revolution, but you've probably heard of his wife, or really his widow, Josephine. Then after the revolution, Josephine married Napoleon Bonaparte and became Empress of the French. So that family connection, through Alexander and ultimately Josephine, is how Stephanie ended up becoming incorporated into the imperial family. It also means that once again, Napoleon has made a cameo in one of my videos, which is something I did not anticipate when I started doing all of this research and making these videos, and I honestly find it just a little bit absurd.